the victims' families and those who testified. We obviously had a lot of them. I'm not going to try to name them all off here, but they've been very patient with us and with the justice system, with our office. This has taken 3.5 years to get to this point, and so I'm very thankful for their patience and their willingness to cooperate as this investigation continued and the trial lingered on. I'd like to thank the jury for their service. This is not an easy thing for anyone to listen to in its entirety. The jury heard a lot of very difficult evidence. Some of y'all may saw on Tuesday the Commissioners Court approved a program. Legislators have put it into effect back in January, but the Commissioners approved it Tuesday at our request to allow for reimbursement for counseling for jurors who have listened to very emotional and painful testimony, which they have here. So we let the jurors know today that that is available to them if they want it. They have the number to contact if they want access to that, but we wanted to make sure that they had that opportunity given really the devastating nature of this case. I'd like to thank Tyler Police Department. Chief Toller is here and his team. He put together a great group of detectives: Jeff Roberts, Greg Roberts, Melinda Weaver, Craig Shine, and others, Wayne Thomas, Tommy Lewis, and many others that worked on this case, Jamie Tarrant. They put in a lot of hours of investigation, very difficult case, tens of thousands of pages of documents, and really a very difficult case to prosecute. And they could not have done that without the cooperation of CHRISTUS Mother Francis. We'd like to thank them. You know, many of, really, if not all of the nurses and doctors and administration there were traumatized and victimized by what the defendant did to them, the trust that he betrayed there. They worked very hard to try to identify all the victims and work with us on getting records and getting interviews with the witnesses. And so this case would not have been possible without their help, and they really went above and beyond to try to make sure that justice was done in this case. I'd like to thank the doctors and nurses that testified. There's a lot of them, so I won't try to name them here, as well as my staff who put in many, many hours. Lance, Chris Gatewood, who couldn't be here today because he had a death in the family during this trial, Emily, Clint, Ron, and so many others who worked really many, many hours putting this case together. I don't think a case quite like this has been seen in Smith County, and hopefully never again. The number of victims, the kinds of intentional and devastating actions that were done. But we're very thankful for the justice system and for the victims in this case of being patient with us. So I'll take any questions that anybody has. I know there's been a lot that we've been sent to our office, but if anybody has any today, we'll answer those if we can.
Mr. Putman, I guess just your reaction from what we learned just a few moments ago, the jury giving Mr. Davis the death sentence, your reaction to that?
We're obviously very thankful for their verdict. We respect their verdict, and we're very grateful that that's what they saw in the evidence. That's what we thought was the appropriate outcome. You know, it's the most severe penalty that we have. Certainly Mr. Davis deserves that and more for what he did. He people deserve the death penalty for a lot less than what he did, so we're very thankful for what he did, what they decided.
What was your reaction to the jury and the guilt-innocence phase taking less than an hour to come back with a conviction?
In a case like this, where really the difficulty in presenting the case is there is so much evidence, and the evidence is overwhelming. Often a jury can hear so much that they are convinced, but you keep putting on evidence for days and days after they've been convinced. So I don't know why they deliberated a short amount of time, but if I had to guess, it would be the case that the detectives put together was so strong that it didn't leave any doubt in their mind.
Your reaction to hearing those phone calls?
They had told us that the epinephrine and norepinephrine
in court the other day, when you heard those for the first time, it really had the entire courtroom in kind of a state of shock. I'm curious what your thoughts were with this.
You know, when this case was presented to our office and we talked to the medical experts, the only conclusion you can come to is someone who would do something like this would have to be cold and calloused and unfeeling. And it's difficult, certainly for the doctors and nurses and his own family, to believe that there's someone they know that could be going around doing those and be that heartless. But it was the only conclusion that could be drawn from the evidence. And then when we got that phone call after he was convicted, it just was direct proof of his mindset that he has no love for anyone but himself, and that what he's done to these families didn't faze him at all.
For the guilt-innocence phase of the trial, why were only 4 of the possible 7 dead victims included? That's
a good question. So this kind of capital murder is 2 or more victims, so we could have charged just 2. One of the things, though, if you're proving capital murder with 2 or more victims in different transactions, but pursuant to the same scheme or course of conduct, which is what we had here. The scheme and course of conduct we were alleging was introducing air into the arterial system. So we wanted to keep it very clear and very simple for the jury. The 4 in the indictment, that's how they were killed, by air into the arterial system. The other victims that died either from air into the venous system or insulin injection. There were other victims that had air in the arterial system, but they're still alive. So they obviously couldn't be included in a murder indictment. So rather than having an indictment covering all of the murder victims, if we did that, we would have had to have covered multiple different ways that they were done. And medically, I thought that would be more confusing than helpful. So the plan was to present the ones that were done the same way, and then let the jury hear about the other victims in the punishment phase, which the law allows. And we talked with our victims' families about that ahead of time to let them know that their family members' cases would be heard and there would be justice for them as well.
What was preparing for this case like, and all the time it took, learning all of the medical terminology, things like that?
Sure.
What was kind of, how did you prepare for this? What were some of the things you did to kind of really nail down all of the technicalities of this?
I'm sure you heard in the testimony from Detective Shine that Tyler Police Department spent about 2,600 hours investigating it. There's, like I said, a team of about 6 of us at the DA's office that have been working on it since he was arrested back in 2018, and getting things ready and preparing motions and preparing evidence. But really, with the help of the police department and CHRISTUS, we've really been doing nothing but this since really the beginning of March. So it's been about 7 months of just working on this case, including obviously the jury selection and trying the case. So it's been many, many late hours, many, many days preparing evidence, going through records, and trying to make sure that the jury could hear all the facts.
Did you get to speak to any of the victims' families after today's decision was read? And so, if not, what have they been going through for the last 3.5 years?
And anytime you have victims in a criminal case, especially one that takes a long time to get to trial, as Steve Lafferty testified to, it, and it drags on, it keeps that wound open. Certainly, the case concluding today doesn't heal all those wounds. We can't bring those people back. But when they know that their loved one's murder is out there and nothing's been done about it, that continues to be a source of pain for them. So they all express a lot of gratitude today that it's over, and a lot of appreciation for the jury's verdict that the defendant got what he deserved.
I'm curious what your reaction is to the witnesses that were called by the defense, one of them being Dr. Schnell, who works for UT Health. And in Willie's closing arguments in the guilt or innocence phase, Mr. Gatewood said that the jury should be insulted by his testimony. I'm curious what kind of your takeaways are from who was called by the defense.
Well, I'd be curious if Dr. Schnell would change his opinion now that the defendant admitted that he did this conduct, since he testified it was medically impossible. But I guess I'll leave that up to him if he wants to change his opinion. As far as our other witnesses, their neuroradiologist really didn't have any disagreement with. He agreed with our experts as far as the pattern of injury, and he provided no cause whatsoever as to how this could have happened. So as far as their witnesses in punishment, everyone has a loved one, everyone has got a brother or a mother, and if they were charged with something, I'm sure people can understand wanting to stand up for them and just say that you love them, but none of their witnesses excused or condoned or really could even comprehend that someone they knew could do something like this. And that's what we expected. And so I certainly don't blame any members of his family or people that knew him as a child for wanting to care for the person they loved. And really, I think they just don't want to accept the fact that they knew somebody that could do something like this.
So the prosecution framed him as a serial killer multiple times. Has East Texas ever seen any murder case on this scale?
Not that I know of. Yeah.
Also, were you expecting Davis to testify for himself?
Obviously, we never know if a defendant's going to choose to testify or not. I didn't expect it in this case. He gave several long recorded interviews that were played to the hospital and to the police. Typically, when those are played in trial, defendants choose not to testify because their story is already out there. And if they were to testify and change their story, that would obviously not be in their best interest. And then in punishment, he might have testified, but after he made that phone call, again, he's got a recorded statement out there. So I didn't expect him to, but you never really know.
The woman that he named in those phone calls, the 96-year-old in the neurological ICU,
Yeah.
will there be an investigation into her death?
I'm sure it'll be looked into. At the same time, many things that he said in that phone call were not true. So certainly the reasons he gave for why he hurt people in the hospital, how those deaths occurred, while he admitted to being responsible, he did not admit to his conduct. So we know that what he was saying in those phone calls was only partially true. So whether or not the person in the ICU in 2016 was really 96 years old or really in the neuro ICU, there's no way to know if that's actually accurate information or was just him trying to manipulate his ex-wife.
Do you think there could be even more victims in this case connected to Davis that we just don't know about or somehow maybe just never really got discovered?
I mean, I'm speculating, but I certainly think it's possible. What we presented to the jury is what we could prove. And really, if you go back further than 2017, it becomes very difficult. You can imagine asking nurses and doctors in different places he's worked to recall what room they were in 4 years ago. That becomes very hazy over time. So I don't think we'll ever be able to prove any more victims, but I don't doubt that there were more before that.
What was the mental toll that it took on the doctors and nurses who were trying to figure out what was going wrong with these patients?
That was part of the prep for this case. As the jury saw, many of them cried on the stand, just talking about the patients. Many more of them cried in our offices when we talked to them. Not just when a patient passes or has a serious stroke like these patients had, they're devastated by that. But to find out that someone they trusted would do it intentionally was devastating to them, really devastating to everybody at the hospital. Caused deep mistrust because once you accept the fact that you know somebody that could do something like this right next to you, then you question yourself, and maybe you aren't able to really judge someone's character. And you could hear that in the phone call with his wife. She obviously did not expect any of this, and so if you can sleep next to somebody and have no idea this is going on, then how could you even trust your own judgment? So it was devastating for everybody.
And how cooperative was management of CHRISTUS during the investigation?
From the beginning, they were cooperative with law enforcement, with our office. They wanted to see the right thing done. Obviously, from a hospital perspective, that's a complicated thing to do because they're worried, obviously, about patient privacy and those kinds of things. But this investigation couldn't have happened without them and without their support.
Is there any one particular piece of evidence that stands out to you as particularly damning or something that you think would have just made it so easy to convict him?
Well, I mean, the piece of evidence that solved the case for the hospital or for the police was the video of Mr. Kalina's case. They knew something was going wrong, but it wasn't clear who and how until that video. So I think that was obviously the key piece of evidence. And then, of course, the piece of evidence we didn't know we were going to have was the phone call and punishment. So those two things, I think, were clearly the things that stood out.
I'm curious, did his ex-wife know that would be played in court?
I don't know. I don't know what she knew. They knew it was recorded, and that's said at the beginning of every call. So.
Are when somebody gets sentenced to death in Smith County, about how long does it take for that process to go through? I mean, how long can you be sitting there?
Sure. The appeals and writ process will start pretty much immediately, and those will go straight to the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals. That process is usually done within a couple of years. The part that takes a long time is the federal system. After you exhaust your state appeals, you can file federal writs, and for various reasons, the federal system takes much longer. So average time on appeal is about 10 to 12 years, but that's obviously dependent on a lot of factors. So.
Closing arguments for the defense today, what did you think of that moment where Mr. Park said that a decent punishment for Mr. Davis would be not seeing his kids grow up or his grandchildren grow up?
Defense attorneys have a tough job. Certainly, if you get into punishment and your client makes a phone call like that, it makes your job a lot harder. So Mr. Parks did the best he could do with the information that he had. Mr. Parks, Mr. Hayes are good lawyers. They had to get up there and say something. The fact that Mr. Davis had small children was something that we recognized would be brought up into trial for sure. They're going to typically exploit any family members that they have. So I was just thankful that they didn't do it by calling them actually into the courtroom, because that's happened in cases before. So I didn't mind him saying it, especially because everybody knew, including the jury, that not having children didn't stop him from committing his crimes. So if he cared for his children, obviously he could have spared them this embarrassment for the rest of their lives by not doing what he did. Anybody else?
Do you believe at all that he says, Kalina was an accident? And you mentioned this a little bit in closing arguments today, but he makes these claims that, many of these are accidental. He didn't mean to hurt these people. Your takeaway is that he's lying.
Yeah, I think that claim is ridiculous. He also made the claim that he did it to prolong their stay at the hospital, except that the first 4 that we know about died basically immediately. And even if that were true, and that he somehow was trying to prolong their illness, for someone to do that, kill their patient, and then try again, you have to be the kind of person who has no empathy, who does not care for another person, who is unconcerned with their well-being, who feels no guilt. So to do that certainly 4 times, that's not the kind of person that's just looking for extra shifts. It's also contradicted the evidence. He said many times he was working all the time, and that he was on every shift. His attorneys even made that argument in guilt innocence that he was working almost every extra shift. So the fact that he needed more shifts was not true. But to be the kind of person to do what he did, it's not an accident. And I think our medical experts who were key to this case as well, Dr. Layton, Dr. Yarborough, and Dr. Crum, were very helpful in explaining that to the police as well as us and the jury, that there's no way this could be accidental.
I was wondering, what's your reaction to, during the trial, he was mainly non-reactive and had moments of reaction. What are your thoughts on that?
Again, I think he doesn't feel regret. I don't think he feels guilt or empathy for his victims. The only time he cried in the phone call, the only time he cried in court was for himself. I found it interesting. The only time I observed him crying was when our expert was talking about what prison life was like. And I don't know about y'all, but I've cried with these victims many times. But even today in victim impact, I can't listen to all these people and the suffering they've been through without it getting to me, and it doesn't faze him.
Are you able to speak on how the jail phone call was obtained, or how you're made aware of it, I guess?
Those are automatically recorded every time. The police and our office have access to them. He's been making calls for the 3.5 years he's been in jail, but hasn't discussed the case. So they weren't introduced into evidence, because most of the time when people make calls from jail, they don't discuss anything interesting. They might discuss what they had for lunch or dinner, so it's not relevant to the case. So, but we listen to those because sometimes people will choose to slip up and start talking about their case, and when they do, that's obviously helpful evidence. So they're always available, and the defense had copies of them as well. We download those and make them available to the defense, so they had them. They knew that he had made the call before we did, actually. Anybody else? Okay. Well, thank y'all very much for coming. If you have any other questions, obviously you can reach out to our office. But just one more time, I'd like to thank the victims and their families and the jury for their deliberation, as well as the Tyler Police Department and the hospital.
That was Smith County District Attorney Jacob Putman describing the trial that resulted this afternoon in a death sentence for William Davis. Now, the district attorney is saying he was very grateful and thankful for the death penalty verdict. He also thanked law enforcement and jurors for their work, along with the doctors and the nurses who testified. A key question that's come up through the case: why was William Davis accused and then convicted of killing 4 patients instead of allegedly killing 7 patients? District Attorney Putman explaining that a primary reason for choosing 4 was because each of those victims were killed in the same way, by introducing air into their arterial lines and ultimately making it easier to understand from a medical standpoint. The DA also sharing details about the death sentence process, explaining that after state and federal appeals processes, William Davis could be on death row for as long as 10 to 12 years. Also on Tuesday, commissioners approved a request to allow reimbursement for counseling for those jurors who listened to testimony. Our in-depth coverage of the case continues online at CBS19.tv and on our mobile app. And of course, we'll bring you the latest during the CBS 19 News at 5. We now return you to your regular scheduled programming.